He wanted to save humanity, but instead, he ruined his own life. The Ostankino TV tower was built according to his project. He invented the spacesuit and the astronaut seat. Because of him, the Americans were able to travel to the moon. But he paid too high a price for his dream. He was accused of sabotage and had needles inserted under his nails. He had to leave his family and his past behind. He assumed the identity of the deceased man. His names were Yuri Kondratuk and Oleksandr Shargay. He was an eccentric and a dreamer who told women about the stars. He also firmly believed that one day he would fly into space. That is why in his short life, he lost 3 women he loved. July 16, 1969. On this day, a historic event takes place. American astronauts plant their national flag on the Earth's moon. This suggests that the U.S. has triumphed in the fierce lunar race. The primary adversary of the USSR was significantly lagging. After the Americans' moon landing, a sensational report surfaced in Life magazine. John Hubal, an American scientist and one of the participants in the flight preparation, said, "We discovered a small, unassuming book published in Russia right after the revolution. The author of this book provided evidence and calculated the energy efficiency of the moon landing." After this interview, a major scandal broke out in the Soviet Union. It can't be. It appears that the Americans were assisted by a citizen of the USSR, a mechanic who spent his entire life working on Siberian grain elevators.
He became a hero in the United States of America. His name is engraved in gold letters at NASA. In the Soviet Union, scientists scoffed at him because he expounded on how to construct spaceships, even though he did not possess any higher education. The name of this obscure inventor is Oleksandr Shargay. He revolutionized the concept of the human mind's potential.
This individual had 2 last names and 2 biographies. Based on one of the last names, he was an officer of the White Guard. Otherwise known, he was a history faculty student who died at a very young age. Throughout his life, he was engaged in political and military conflicts. But he desired only one thing: to journey into space. To achieve this goal, he deprived himself of food, worked tirelessly, and maintained a regular training regimen. And all because Sashko Shargay, a resident of Poltava, had nothing to tie him down to earth. He learned about pain and injustice before he was even born. His mother was arrested by the police at a protest when she was 8 months pregnant. Labeled as a revolutionary, she was imprisoned. A pregnant woman was brutally tortured there. She was so affected that she was transferred from prison to a psychiatric hospital. But surprisingly, her son Sashko was born completely healthy. And just as unhappy. In the early years of life, this child lost both parents. The world seemed so cold and unfair. It was then that little Sashko Shargay started noticing the stars. It was then that he created his own world. In reality, he lived with his grandparents in Poltava. In his imagination, he traversed the galaxies, discovered new planets and civilizations. He not only believed in their existence, but also started searching for a way to realize his dream.
Even then, the boy had ideas and thoughts that even the most distinguished scientists could only dream of. And he is still a boy.
Later, Sashko's childhood fascination will transform into an adult obsession. He will have to endure 2 deaths, 2 wars, imprisonment, and separation from loved ones. His entire life will descend into chaos. And the worst part is that there will be no way to go back.
but now the goal seems so attainable. As a result, Sashko Shargay neglects his studies at the gymnasium and frequently skips classes. After all, this time could be used more beneficially. It was then that he began to secretly prepare for a trip to the moon. He invented an entire training system. And most importantly, he is developing a strategy for future flights.
For several years, Sashko devoted almost all his time to his drawings. But one day, he suddenly lost the ability to compute and derive his formulas. And the girl, his neighbor of the same age, Victoria Hartman, was responsible for this. Because of her, the reserved, introverted guy started going to the gym again. After the training, he escorted the girl home from a distance. Initially, Victoria was taken aback and attempted to distance herself from the peculiar admirer. However, Sashko didn't pay attention to the insults and ridicule. And so one day, he caught up with Victoria and told her a magical tale about the moon and stars. He said that soon everyone will have the opportunity to travel into space and that people will construct new cities on the moon. He told her how beautiful it was on Mars. And then a miracle happened. Victoria was fascinated, not by Mars and the moon, but by this passionate, persuasive man. He was a dreamer, and at 16, you want to believe in your dreams. Now they meet every day. They could talk for hours, making plans for the future. Victoria persuaded Sashko to show his drawings to the experts. She is sure that it will be appreciated. And one day he will truly be able to fly to the moon, but only if he is very cautious there. So subtly, their passions evolved into love, and their dreams intersected with reality. Russia and Germany were gearing up for war. Victoria Hartman's father is German. Now he was eager to get his family out of Russia. Therefore, Victoria and Sashko could no longer be together. This news was a shock to both of them. Victoria asks Sashko to accompany her, but he declines. He doesn't want to be a burden on her parents. Time will pass, and Shargay will regret not having gone with them then. He will always dream of going to Germany and finding a woman like Victoria. But so far, Sashko hasn't realized that they are parting forever. After the girl leaves, he fulfills all the dreams they once shared together.
Sashko Shargay graduated from high school with a silver medal and was admitted to the St. Petersburg Polytechnic Institute without competition. To enhance his drawings and calculations, he requires new knowledge. However, Shargay will never be able to pursue higher education. Very soon his life will undergo a radical change, and studying at the Institute will forever remain his unreachable dream.
1914, World War I. Shargay studied at the St. Petersburg Polytechnic Institute for only a few months. Suddenly he, a freshman, was drafted to the front line along with others. Thus, the serene and dreamy star boy finds himself in the throes of war. There is blood and murder all around him. And here, in the trenches, he once again finds salvation in his world. There are no wars on the moon. If he calculates everything correctly, he will be able to escape from this hell and fly away. Sashko is now constantly writing something in his notebook. In the evenings, he entertains other soldiers with stories about journeys to the stars. The soldiers laughed heartily, and Shargay himself imagined traveling from Earth to the moon hundreds of times. And then he understood how it should be. It was there, at the forefront, that Shargay sketched his route in a notebook and dubbed it the snail route. He could not have imagined that 40 years would pass before a man would fly to the moon using his plan. If he found out about this flight, he would be more surprised than anyone else. Why will this flight be conducted by Americans, not his compatriots?
The war was over, and Shargay breathed a sigh of relief. Eventually, he will relinquish his weapon, pursue his studies, and finish his manuscript. The young man believes that his calculations will enable people to travel into space. Some Earthlings will relocate to the moon. Then these senseless wars for territory will finally cease. At the time, he did not realize that the war would not release him so easily.
After being demobilized from the front, he was forcibly conscripted into Kornilov's forces. And once again, he runs away from that place.
Sashko Shargay has a hard time moving to Kyiv. A few days later, it disappears. No one will remember him anymore. Simultaneously with his vanishing, another individual remarkably resembling Shargay will emerge, as identical as two peas in a pod. Who is this? A twin brother? Why is this deceased student, who bears the face of Shargay, named Yuri Kondratyuk? Once a loader at one of Kyiv's markets abandoned his cargo halfway through. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, sat down on the ground, and began to write something. Suddenly, he had a brilliant idea. It would be much more efficient if only a portion of the spacecraft landed on the moon, not the entire spacecraft. The other part will be awaiting connection in orbit. How did he not consider this earlier?
This is the same person, Oleksandr Shargay. He fled from the Denikin forces to complete his manuscript in tranquility. But now he is compelled to complete it at night, or simply among the smelly market stalls. And he has a different first and last name. He will sign his book under a different name, not Oleksandr Shargay, but Yuri Kondratyuk. What made him go into hiding and change his name?
The truth about this disappearance only came to light recently. For over half a century, this truth was zealously guarded by Shargay's family, his stepmother and half-sister. The deserter Sashko Shargay went to Kyiv from the front, turning to them. Now, after the death of his grandparents, they were his only remaining family. According to the stepmother's story, Sashko was planning to continue his studies in Kyiv, but soon he had to abandon these dreams. The Bolsheviks came to power, and a terrible mark appeared on his biography, White Guard.
To save her stepson, Olena Kariva, Sashko's stepmother, took a desperate measure. She delivered him the documents of another individual, the deceased Yuri Kondratyuk. He had never engaged in any conflict, so he should not have raised suspicion from the authorities. But now Shargay actually had to assume the deceased man's position.
Initially, Sashko was scared because he would be living under someone else's name and someone else's life. But there was no escape. Otherwise, he would have been discovered and shot. Thus, Shargay became Kondratyuk's revived student.
He had never met this Kondratyuk and knew nothing about his family at all. When they begin questioning him, he's unable to provide any information about his father or mother. He is from Poltava, while Kondratyuk is a Volhynian from Lutsk. He was a student who succumbed to tuberculosis in Kiev.
Problems with changing the surname started right away. And then this foreign name of the deceased will haunt Shargay for the rest of his life. Yuri Kondratuk had no standing with the new government. First and foremost, the children of proletarians and party members must now be educated. He was not admitted for study. And then Shargay Kondratyuk realized that his dream had ended. Under these circumstances, he'll never get the chance to be educated and become a scientist. This means that he will have to forget about the universe. Then he tries to change his destiny. He is secretly trying to reach Germany. The first thing he will do there is to search for his beloved Victoria. He will enroll in a higher technical education institution, but he was held at the border.
It was prepared in a very interesting way. He turned bread into crumbs, and crumbs into flour, into powder. He boiled the eggs, dried them, and then grated them in the same way. He prepared his own canned food. He made these cans himself. And with that, he appeared at the border. It appears that he should be arrested, penalized, and so forth. When they saw his luggage, bread ground into flour, they thought he was insane and let him go.
He returned from the trip ill, and then he finally realized that he had been ensnared in a trap. Now he will have to abandon his dream of higher education forever. He also has to come to terms with the fact that he will never see Victoria Hartman again. But he will not abandon his dream of space.
Henceforth, Shargay Kondratyuk lives in abject poverty. He works as a freight handler, electrician, and furnace operator. He gives all the money he earns to his stepmother and sister. He creates special traps for birds and consumes the sparrows caught in them. He will spend the rest of his life thanking his family for saving him, and will continue to send them money.
It's remarkable that during this most challenging period of his life, Shargay independently performs all the necessary calculations for a moon flight. Soon, a simple porter will finish the manuscript of his book. He called it Conquest of Interplanetary Space. This is a small paper notebook, signed under his alias, Yuri Kondratuk. The author submits it to the main directorate for scientific institutions, hoping that the book will be assessed and published. Then Shargay Kondratyuk had no clue. In 40 years, the top scientists in the United States will champion the ideas presented in this book. After the revolution, Oleksandr Shargay, a member of the White Guard and an inventor, changed his name to save his life. He assumes the identity of a deceased student from Lutsk, Yuri Kondratyuk. He is writing a book titled The Conquest of Interplanetary Spaces and sending it to Moscow for review. And suddenly, he urgently departed from Kyiv, distancing himself as much as possible from the city where he was recognized and where the true identity of the student Kondratyuk was known. He goes to Kuban, where he can continue his starry-eyed quest. There, the engineer is compelled to work as a regular mechanic on grain elevators. However, Kondratyuk quickly rose to prominence in Kuban. Every year he patents small, useful inventions. He could solve any technical issue, but he gained fame not as an inventor, but as an extraordinary eccentric. He is always disheveled, reserved, and in a shabby suit, and with whom you could only talk about one thing: the moon.
There was an instance in Kuban where grain elevators were constructed. After work, it was clear that it was night. He informed his colleagues or friends about it. Do you see the moon over the grain elevator? I'll be there soon.
Do you find it odd when a person doesn't pay attention to their appearance? A person who doesn't pay attention to their diet? A person who can sometimes be disorganized and unkempt, but is always consumed by a certain idea.
Whether in the cold or heat, he sleeps on the hard floor in a regular sleeping bag, bare. He does not drink or smoke. He spends his free time in the basement. Why does he do this? Nobody understood him, so everyone concluded that this eccentric individual was suffering from a long-standing, unrequited love.
Since then, there has been no other woman in his life. At home, there was always a picture of Victoria Hartman on the table. He believed that Victoria was alive, that she was waiting for him. His only desire was to escape the Soviet Union. After all, he is not required here. Mechanic named after the deceased. A strange person that no one understands. After all, the book he was so proud of simply went unnoticed in Moscow. But one winter, Kondratyuk received a letter. Sender's address, Moscow, Main Department of Scientific Institutions. It was a response to his manuscript, The Conquest of Interplanetary Space. His hands were trembling with excitement, and then he felt lightheaded with joy. His manuscript received high praise from a scientific reviewer, Professor Vichenkin. In the letter, the heads of science pledged to publish the book soon at their own expense. He was over the moon. The joyful anticipation lasted an entire year, but the book was never published. In the second letter, he was informed that the subject of his work was not relevant.
But in reality, the reason for neglecting the book was entirely different. Upon verifying the author's identity, it became evident that he does not possess a higher education degree. How is it possible for the work of an unremarkable individual to be published when hundreds of books by esteemed professors and associate professors are still in the process of preparation?
Disappointment was replaced by anger. Now Kondratyuk has decided to self-publish his book. Many months of saving, forgoing everything except the most essential. And finally, the book was published. Kondratyuk's friend, engineer Petro Gorchakov, helped him distribute it. However, the scientific work did not resonate with the readers at all, so it was sold for a nominal amount. Furthermore, a book that would have created a stir in the United States went unnoticed here.
The fact is, everyone around him treated him with much ridicule and a touch of irony at that time, saying, "What, flights to the moon?" But he believed. He was certain that such a time would inevitably come. And the people around him, of course, were skeptical about it. He was certain that all this would come true one day.
Instead, Kondratyuk made good friends at Gorchakov's house. A pragmatic friend will now bring all his ideas to life. And his wife, Olga, will feed the perpetually hungry inventor. She will listen to his cosmic ideas with enthusiasm. She was so friendly that Kondratyuk began to forget about his beloved Victoria. He didn't even realize when he fell in love with his friend's wife. Both Olga and her husband knew about it. But they regarded this love as another one of Kondratyuk's peculiarities.
Once, after buying a bouquet of roses for Peter Kirillovich Gorchakov's wife, he returned with these flowers in a briefcase. He entered, and everyone sat down to drink tea. He sits on his briefcase, sipping tea and contemplating what he wants to say to Mrs. Gorchakov. And suddenly, at the end of this celebration, he suddenly remembers, opens his briefcase, and pulls out a crumpled bouquet of roses. Confused, he hands it over to Gorchakov's wife. She often, I would say, laughed quite sarcastically at this forgetfulness of a prominent person, at his absent-mindedness.
No attempts at reconciliation. He simply loved her in a platonic and devoted way, just as he loved his Victoria. Now his heart is peacefully divided between both women. And it was to Olga Gorchakova that Kondratyuk revealed his greatest secret. He explained to her why he sleeps in a bag, why he doesn't eat properly, and why he continually exercises. But when Olga heard the answer, she laughed. It turned out that Yuri Kondratuk was seriously preparing for a moon flight. He will fly in a rocket that he will build himself.
He was sure of this, it was possible, and he strongly believed in it. Even at a fairly advanced age, friends who often joked about this profound faith eventually gave up. Because he responded very sincerely that it was possible. He even promised to take some of his friends with him on this flight.
Dreams and the serene comfort of a circle of friends soothed the scientist. But at night, he continued to gaze longingly at the moon, where everything will be different for him. He wrote that it was there that he would have a wife and children bathed in moonlight. Such a celestial family. These hopes for a bright future were shattered forever. In 1933, they came for him at night. He was taken away discreetly without any charges. He ended up in prison, and he didn't even know why. Did they discover his secret, learn his real name and past? Unbelievable. The real reason for the arrest of the inventor was the grain storage facility that he built.
11 of his teeth were knocked out, and needles were driven under his nails. And all so that he could confess his terrible crime to the authorities and society. He was accused of constructing a granary and covertly causing damage during the construction process.
That year, a massive granary named Mastadon was constructed in Siberia based on Kondratyuk's design. It was as tall as a 10-story building and was considered the largest in the world at that time. And this task was entrusted to Yuri Kondratuk, because he suggested constructing a grain elevator without using a single nail, employing the ancient techniques of Siberian artisans. Only when the works were completed did the NKVD decide that this project was a challenge.
He was accused of sabotage for constructing a grain elevator without nails, as nails were simply not available in the Soviet Union, specifically in Soviet Russia. He was accused of causing the grain elevator to break down, but it had been standing for 70 years.
Someone could have reported him. Someone could say it was his idea. This mastodon is going to collapse because it has very few nails.
The Kondratyuk elevator in the Siberian city of Kameny-on-Oby was only dismantled at the beginning of the 21st century. And not due to a malfunction, but because the building is simply obsolete. But its inventor paid the price for his innovation. Kondratyuk was incarcerated for 3 years in the camps. Petro Horchakov was arrested alongside him. He was recognized as the head of Kondratyuk 5 years ago. Dreadful living conditions, inhumane labor, starvation, and freezing temperatures. Both friends had no chance of making it out of there alive. However, a miracle occurred. Olga Gorchakova saved her husband and his friend from death. Through numerous letters and petitions, the unfortunate woman managed to have the camps substituted with exile to Western Siberia. It was thanks to the woman they loved that the engineers were saved. They ended up in engineering office number 14 of the so-called Sharashka, where talented prisoners were employed. Scientists from all across the Union were also unjustly condemned. What were they supposed to develop at UCB number 14? Kondratyuk never talked about it. But 3 years later, he was discharged with a diagnosis of neurasthenia. He was always anxious, constantly looking around, fearful of strangers and even old friends. He felt guilty for building his grain storage. He never visited the Gorchakovs' house again. Now Kondratyuk was alone again, without a source of income, without a home. Almost friendless, and even without a name of his own, alone with his secret.
There were only a few people to whom he could reveal his secret. Try to live with a secret all the time. And here's a serious secret. Try living under someone else's name. Living under an assumed name for more than 20 years, knowing nothing about the person whose name you carry.
That's how Yuri Kondratyuk found himself in Moscow and unexpectedly received an opportunity to fulfill his dream. Next, without a commercial break, which ghost did Kondratyuk see in Moscow? How did a former schoolgirl manage to win the heart of a genius inventor? The mysterious disappearance of Kondratyuk. Death or escape? Former prisoner Kondratyuk arrived in Moscow famished and worn out. He wandered the streets aimlessly. Suddenly, he saw someone he never expected to see in his life, Victoria Hartman. First love. But how could she have ended up in Moscow? He looked at her and could not believe it. In front of him stood a girl who bore an uncanny resemblance to Victoria. At the same time, she resembled a typical schoolgirl from the provinces. But Kondratyuk's heart was fluttering. He approached the girl and began to speak in a language that he didn't understand, but she did. Her name was Galina Pletnyova. She worked in a printing house. The encounter with Kondratyuk initially frightened her and subsequently turned her world upside down. They met almost every day. Galina listened to stories about space and then fell in love with this eccentric. Even the fact that he had just been released from prison didn't cause harm, and soon she became his wife. No weddings or signings of any kind. He was very scared of being discovered, so they simply began cohabitating.
Their relationship? They are worldly, humane, and deeply intellectual. They are intimate. And I would say that to find an answer to the question so that he would admit his love for someone else. Clearly living under the name Yuri Kondratyuk, he understood that it was risky. Obviously, he did not want to endanger the people close to him.
He showed Helena a world of stars that she had never seen before. She taught him the simplest things. Make the bed, brew coffee, sew on buttons. Gradually, this peaceful life rejuvenated Kondratyuk. He reconciled with his former friends Olga and Petro Horchakov. Together, they continued their engineering developments. And then they got another opportunity to realize their dream.
The Council of People's Commissars issued a resolution on the design and upcoming construction of a wind farm on Mount I Petri in Crimea. A competition was announced. Kondratyuk and Gorchakov participated in this competition. Who would have thought that the first place would be taken by guys who apparently have nothing to do with wind energy? That they would win this competition.
It was supposed to be a colossal tower as tall as a skyscraper. Kondratyuk had to pay a substantial amount for the project. Finally, he had an opportunity to escape poverty. He would be able to continue working on his project to fly to the moon. But this dream never came true. Construction of the power plant at I Petri has suddenly halted. This occurred because the project initiator, Hrihori Ordzonikidze, has passed away. The project is on hold until further notice. However, time will pass, and it will be Yuri Kondratuk's design that other engineers will use to construct the world's tallest Ostankino TV tower. They will be awarded the Lenin Prize for this. Of course, then no one will remember Kondratyuk.
And the brilliant inventor would become a laughingstock in the Soviet Union. All attempts by Kondratyuk's colleagues to recognize him as a scientist were unsuccessful. Official Soviet science did not wish to acknowledge a self-taught scientist. He was also a former inmate.
After the wind farm project fell through, Kondratyuk suffered another nervous breakdown. He didn't sleep well and behaved like a cornered animal. All hopes for space travel were dashed. Yuri understood that despite his efforts, he couldn't showcase the worth of his deserving projects in this country. During this challenging period, Galina Pletnyova was by his side, but she couldn't do anything to help. Living together, albeit in a civil union, Galina Pletnyova and Kondratyuk lived together for 7 years, but the woman was never meant to discover who her husband truly was. He vanished from her life as abruptly as he had entered it. In June 1941, Yuri Kondratuk packed his notes and designs into a large yellow suitcase. He said goodbye to his wife and disappeared.
Given his biography, it's plausible that he simply wanted to escape from this earth.
Then she found out that her husband had volunteered to go to the front. And in the winter of 1942, Helena received her last letter from the front. Soon she discovered that her husband, Yuri Kondratyuk, had gone missing. The war came to an end, and everyone disregarded the unsuccessful scientist. 20 years later, an intense space race commenced between the Soviet Union and the United States. What Kondratyuk had dreamed of has come true. Man flew into space.
Earth, I am an astronaut. I feel great. I'm continuing the flight.
In May 1961, a month after Gagarin's flight, John F. Kennedy set a monumental task for American scientists to surpass the Soviet Union. A man must be landed on the moon before the start of 1970. Scientists are worried about how they can develop technology for a lunar mission in such a short time frame. And then John Hubal, deputy chief of the Dynamic Loads Division, unexpectedly discovers a small, worn-out book in the Library of Congress titled The Conquest of Interplanetary Spaces. The book was published in 1929. It is set in Siberia. The author is the obscure engineer Yuri Kondratuk. In his book, he explains how a rocket can reach the moon and land on it.
The ideas and calculations in this book appear brilliant to Hubal. But when he presents them in Congress, they just laugh at him. Surely the writer must have been a somewhat unconventional Ukrainian, else why weren't his concepts executed in the Union?
John Hubal is a part of every committee. And suddenly, in a remarkable turn of events, he was invited to speak at a very important meeting in Washington. He is preparing a speech about Kondratyuk's ideas and heading to the U.S. Capitol with hope. However, just before the speech, paragraphs dedicated to the achievements of the Ukrainian scientist were removed from his speech. In desperation, the scientist decides to undertake a daring act.
Hubal broke his chain of command and wrote a letter to NASA Assistant Director Robert Siemens. I experienced the situation of a man crying in the wilderness. But this cannot continue. Give us the authorization and we will send people to the moon in no time. This was Hubal's final attempt to introduce Kondratyuk's unique ideas to American scientists. At that time, he had little hope of understanding.
However, a miracle occurred, and John Hubal's letter impressed NASA Assistant Director Robert Stevens. He forwards it to NASA headquarters in Washington. And then Kondratyuk's idea was finally taken seriously. This was fundamentally different from how American scientists planned to reach the moon.
The idea was as follows. Well, as they say, the shotgun approach. A shot was fired here, a shell landed there. Kondratyuk had a completely different idea. The rocket launched and orbited the Earth, then set a course for the moon. Not to land immediately, but to orbit the moon.
Thus, John Hubal became one of the primary advisors in the preparation for the moon expedition. The more he delves into Kondratyuk's works, the more he becomes fascinated with the inventor's own destiny. After extensive research, Hubal managed to reconstruct part of Kondratyuk's biography. He was incredibly astonished that such an individual went to the front lines as a private and perished there. Hubal had no idea that Kondratyuk could have been around all this time. He could watch the space race and the launch of the Apollo spacecraft along with everyone else.
Incidentally, his works make references to America. He writes that only America, with its financial resources, can execute these projects. The use of his project by the Americans saved them tens of billions of dollars, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars.
In 1969, the Apollo spacecraft launched from Cape Canaveral. First, he surpassed the snail path, a concept developed 50 years ago by the obscure Siberian mechanic Yuri Kondratuk. Then a small module with astronauts detached from Apollo and landed on the surface of the moon. This was also devised by Yuri Kondratuk. The expedition was a success. Kondratyuk's dream came true. Thanks to the Americans, the entire world got to know about Kondratyuk. After that, the Soviet Union started looking for this unidentified scientist. And then the truth was revealed.
It turns out that Kondratyuk is not actually Kondratyuk. And when they inadvertently displayed the photo, of course, the intelligence services were involved. Teacher at the Poltava gymnasium. Of course, the person is already elderly. He said, "Sure, this is Oleksandr Shargay." He recognized his pupil.
Only two people in the world knew about Shargay's name change. These were his stepmother, Olena Kariva, and his sister, Nina. They swore never to tell anyone about their relative's secret. And they kept their word. Only before her death did Nina Shargay reveal her brother's secret to the Soviet authorities. But even she did not know about his fate in the war.
How did Shargay Kondratyuk actually die? Many scientists are still pondering this question. We can only speculate as there is no official death certificate for Shargay Kondratyuk. This is the final secret that the renowned inventor bequeathed to humanity.
Most researchers believe that Kondratyuk perished in the war. However, there are several versions of his disappearance. The first theory is that Kondratyuk voluntarily surrendered to fulfill his dream, have the opportunity to work on personal projects. In Germany, under the leadership of the scientist Baron von Braun, they were engaged in the development of the famous V rockets. Soviet intelligence was convinced that Kondratyuk had reached Germany. In the documentation of von Braun's staff, they discovered an individual with the surname Kondratyuk.
When we discuss mysteries, we refer to those that have not yet been solved. How could his primary manuscripts and calculations end up in Werner von Braun's archive? This was discovered after the war in Peenemünde, and so on and so forth. How do you explain this?
The second theory of the scientist's disappearance is even more fantastical. For a long time, the Soviet Union mistook Yuri Kondratyuk for the German scientist von Braun. He simply hid behind another name. To retaliate against the Soviet Union, he initially worked in Germany and then relocated to the United States. According to the third version proposed by researchers, Kondratyuk was not captured at all. Afraid of further persecutions, he escaped from the front lines and spent the remainder of his life in some place in Siberia. Kondratyuk disappeared along with his yellow suitcase. The chapter that was never included in the book Conquest of Interplanetary Spaces vanished along with the suitcase.
It is said that this chapter was authored by him, but no one has ever held it in their hands or seen it until today. It is still unknown who possesses it to this day.
He was very afraid that all these ideas would be used for evil, not good. He even crossed out some of his ideas and statements from these notebooks. He clearly assumed that humanity could utilize them. Not the way he planned.
Some researchers argue that these were most likely developments related to the space tunnel. The aim of these developments was to establish a lasting link between the Earth and the Moon. The concepts in Kondratyuk's final manuscript could have drastically altered the course of space exploration history. And it is possible that someday we will hear again about Kondratyuk's enigmatic suitcase. He was striving for heaven because he was too lonely on Earth, and eventually he reached it. In honor of Kondratyuk, the Americans named a crater on the far side of the Moon and a route used for spacecraft travel from Earth to the Moon after him. His name was inscribed in gold letters at the NASA Astronautics Museum. In 1970, astronaut Neil Armstrong visited Novosibirsk. He located house number 24 on Sovietskaya Street, where Kondratyuk once resided and worked, and collected a sample of soil from its vicinity. In memory of the man who made Armstrong a historical figure,